Welcome back to the Morning Kickoff YouTube show. I'm your host, Matt Witt. And today we are here to talk about 5 Vikings positional battles for the 2022 season. Now, we're here after the NFL draft has just concluded. We are here to talk about positional battles to look for in training camp, to look for in the preseason, and during the regular season as well. I've selected 5 positions which are completely open, and we're going to be making our predictions as who's going to win these positions and really players that are competing for the position. This might be I do a lot of traditions basically on the channel over the last few seasons. This might be one of the ones that I'm most excited for. I love making predictions and I love competition. I love watching these players in training camp, in OTAs, in preseason, competing for the position and just to see who ends up with the starting role. And this is what I love doing on this channel. So I hope you all join in and talk about who you believe is going to win these starting positions. Starting it off with the first one, and that's going to be our third defensive lineman. I really didn't know what to call this. Are we going to call this the 4 tech, the 3 tech? Are we going to call it a defensive end? I mean, I don't know. We really have no idea because with an entire new coaching staff, we don't know what our coaching staff is going to do. What are we going to call this? So I just called it the third defensive lineman because Ed Donatel in charge of this defense can really use them in many different ways. I believe there are 6 players currently competing for the third starting defensive lineman. That's obviously alongside Harrison Phillips and Dalvin Tomlinson. I've selected 6 players who I believe are competing for this position. That would be Armon Watts, who's coming off of an outstanding year 3, and now going into year 4, going out to contract year, might even enter the season as a starter after being a great stud pass rusher for his size this last season, and also great against the run. I believe Armon Watts could be a potential starting caliber defensive lineman this next season. If it's not Armon Watts, we do have Kenny Willekes, who's going into year 3 out of Michigan State, who's just completely already been a hit in the 7th round and potentially going to be a starter this next season. We also have James Lynch, year 3 player out of Baylor. We have Janarius Robinson, who's 2nd-year player, 4th round draft pick out of Florida State. We didn't get to see much of Janarius Robinson this last season as he was injured. And then after Janarius Robinson, we do have our 2 Pitt defensive linemen who are going into their 2nd year, that being Patrick Jones and Jalen Twyman, who we didn't get to see much of this last season, but both going into their 2nd year could be competing for the starting role. If I was going to break it down, I'm really only looking at Armon Watts, James Lynch, and Kenny Willekes here to compete for that starting role right now, as the other players are very young. They're all going into year 2. But if I was going to be making my prediction, yes, I'm going to actually put my money on Kenny Willekes becoming a starting defensive end this next season, or starting third defensive lineman this next season for the Minnesota Vikings. That's a 7th round draft pick from Michigan State going into year 3 and already winning the starting role. This is my personal opinion. This is my prediction as of May 5th, 2022. We're going to see how this goes on in training camp. These are positions that we're going to look at. We're going to have to see how Kenny Willekes looks in preseason, in training camp, and see who is going to actually win this role. So I put this as the biggest one because I believe as of right now, this is the most unpredictable position in the entire Minnesota Vikings roster, as we didn't draft anybody who's going to be a clear starter day 1. We have no clue who's going to be starting as our third defensive lineman alongside Harrison Phillips and Dalvin Tomlinson. For the second one, we have cornerback. This is going to be both our outside corner, who's going to play alongside Patrick Peterson, and also at the nickel corner positions. Right now, we have 4 corners on this Vikings depth chart who are competing for starting positions, both as an outside corner and as a nickelback. As we know, Ed Donatel loves run a lot more nickelbacks than we've seen in the past with the Mike Zimmer ran defense. A lot of teams are running a lot more 11 personnel, so I'd expect to see a nickel being used a lot more than any time we've seen in Vikings history going into this next season. As of right now, Andrew Booth Jr., 2nd round player who we just drafted, our 2nd round rookie out of Clemson, 22-year-old player, should be a day 1 starter on our Vikings defense if he does not look good, because yes, rookies, even though they're drafted high, even though you're drafted in the 1st and 2nd round, you still have to win your spot, your roster spot at the starting position. Andrew Booth Jr. is not at all right now a lock to be a starter day 1. However, it's more likely than not that he will be. If he's not, we will see Cameron Dantzler start alongside Patrick Peterson, 3rd-year player out of Mississippi State, who been on and off. He's been on and off his first couple seasons, but still, I'd expect Cameron Dantzler to be a transitional guy. If he's not a starter, I'd expect him to transition on the outside. And then for our nickelbacks, we have Harrison Hand and Chris Boyd, both competing to be that starting nickel for the Vikings right now. 2 great tacklers, larger guys. You can move them around the field. If not Harrison Hand or Chris Boyd, I didn't put him on this list, but Cam Bynum. I mean, we could see Cam Bynum start at nickel. He's a converted safety out of Cal going into year 2, just had an outstanding rookie season. And in my opinion, the best defensive rookie this last year for the Vikings was Cam Bynum. We could see him transition into the nickelback position if Ed Donatel wants to use him that way. If it was my prediction, I'm saying Andrew Booth Jr. is going to be our starting outside corner. And for starting nickelback, I might actually put Cameron Dancer. Maybe. I don't know who's going to be our starting nickel right now. I wonder what you all think who would start at nickel for us. And then for the third spot, we have our interior offensive line position, that being at right guard and center. This is huge. You guys, in the preseason, in training camp, you have to look at our offensive linemen right now, because this really is the backbone to the future for our NFL franchise. As Garrett Bradbury and Jesse Davis will likely not be for the Vikings in this next, they will start this next season. They will. After that, we have no clue. And we know how it looks with Kirk Cousins. We need a stacked offensive line in order to be a complete offense. There is no question the Vikings are a top 5 offense right now on paper, looking at playmakers and looking at our upside. No question, but really our offensive line is the backbone. So while I'm talking about right guard and center here, I'm also looking at Christian Darrisaw at left tackle. I'm looking at Ezra Cleveland at left guard. But as of right now, right guard and center are the two biggest positional battles on our offensive line. So as of right now, Garrett Bradbury going into year 4 contract year, we did not pick up his 5th-year option after being a first-round draft pick. We decided to pass on him, so he will only be with the team for 1 more year. We brought in Jesse Davis from the Indianapolis Colts on a 1-year contract. I believe it was. Yes, we brought him in on a 1-year contract, not from the Colts. We brought him in from Miami. He's 31 years old, will likely be here 1 year. And then after that, we're really looking at the next man up, the next dudes who can be starters in the 2023 season, or maybe even start the 2022 season, depending on how our starters look. Those players being Ed Ingram, who we drafted in the 2nd round of this year's draft out of LSU, that being Wyatt Davis, who we drafted in the 3rd round out of the 2021 draft from Ohio State. 2 potential starters for the Vikings. Ed Ingram can play both right guard or center for us. Wyatt Davis likely will play right guard for us if he does get an opportunity to play. Outside of that, we do have Chris Reed, who we brought in a 2-year contract from the Indianapolis Colts. We have Schlottman, who we brought in on a 1-year contract from Denver. We have Oli Udoh still. I slid Oli Udoh into here. Oli Udoh, going into the last year of his contract, had a terrible 2021 season. Hope to not see him, and I hope he doesn't even make the roster. That meaning that the other players look good. And then Kyle Hinton, I put him on this list as well. 7th-round draft pick going into year 3. Those are a lot of names, and that's a huge list of players right there. This, like I said, is the backbone for the future for the Vikings. Garrett Bradbury, not it. He was a bust in the 1st round. Now who's going to be the next man up for him? We could see Schlottman get an opportunity. We could see Ed Ingram. These are players who've played center in the past. If not, we could see Wyatt Davis step into the role as well. I'm a huge Wyatt Davis fan, and I want to see what he can do for our Vikings team going forward. Right guard and center, big positional battle to watch for in the preseason, and I am excited to watch for him in the preseason and in training camp. For the 4th on this list, we have our special teams returners. Back again. Every single year after year, we're talking about special teams returner being a positional battle on this Vikings roster. This year, it's the same list it was last year, except without Amir Abdullah. Right now, we have 3 players competing for the kick and punt returners for the Minnesota Vikings, that being Kane Nwangu, 2nd-year player out of Iowa State. I believe as of right now, he has locked in the role as a starting kick returner. There's no question about it. Kane Nwangu is the best kick returner we have had since Cordero Patterson. With that being said, I didn't put him as a lock for the position because we only saw him play 1 season, and we could see maybe Osborne or Amir Smith-Marset step up into the spot and also take his role as a starting kick returner. When it comes to starting punt returner, KJ Osborne and Amir Smith-Marset are playing for the punt return roles as of right now. If it's my guess, I'm going to give it to Amir just because of how bad KJ Osborne's been as a punt returner. That's a huge opening on the Vikings roster right now, is at the punt return positions. But if I'm going to put my money on it, Kane Nwangu, starting kick returner, Amir Smith-Marset, starting punt returner. Both 2nd-year players out of Iowa. 1 from Iowa State, 1 from the University of Iowa. And for the last 5th on this list, we have tight end. I slid tight end into this list simply because even though Irv Smith Jr. is a lock to be the starter, he still has to win his position. Even though Irv Smith Jr. going into year 4, now on contract year from Alabama, 2nd-year player or 2nd-round draft pick, going into year 4, still only 24 years old. That's very young for a year 4 player. He still has to win a spot. like we've seen in the past, Irv Smith Jr. has done great as a backup tight end to Kyle Rudolph. After we move on from Kyle Rudolph, we name him the starter. He tears his meniscus, and we have yet to see what he can do as a starting caliber tight end. So with that being said, I put this on the list just because Irv Smith Jr. still has to win his role. And outside of that, nobody is competing for the tight end spot. Like I've said many times, this might be the most thin position on the Vikings roster is at tight end. I think Irv Smith Jr. is going to be great. Don't get me wrong. We just have to see him be great first. We have to see what he can do as a tight end first. And hopefully this upcoming season in preseason and in training camp, we can see a lot of Irv Smith Jr. And I'm just hoping he looks 100% to play for the 2022 season. If not, we do have Johnny Munt, who we just brought in from the Rams on a 2-year contract. He's worked with Kevin O'Connell, or Kevin O'Connell has worked with him in the past. So I'd expect Munt to see a significant amount of reps as a first-year player in Minnesota. Outside of that, we do have Zach Davidson, second-year player out of Central Missouri, I believe it was. Central Missouri, 5th-round draft pick in 2021. We have Ben Ellison, Minnesota native, played at NDSU, going into year 4, I believe it is. Year 2. No, year 2 it is, not year 4. And then we have Nick Muse, who we drafted in the 7th round out of South Carolina. So those are our 5 tight ends right there. And honestly, I'm going to make kind of a bold prediction right here. I believe Irv Smith Jr. is going to be our starting tight end, no question. Johnny Munt is going to be on the active roster. And Zach Davidson, Ben Ellison, and Nick Muse don't even make the roster. Yeah, I believe the Vikings are only going to have 2 tight ends in this upcoming roster. And hear me out. The reason why I think the Vikings are only going to have 2 tight ends instead of 3, because we typically have 3 or 4, is just because when you look at how KOC runs the offense, he doesn't run a lot of 2 tight end sets. You typically see 1 tight end, or if there's not 1 tight end, you see no tight ends on the field at a time. So what I think KOC is going to do here, he's going to have Irv Smith Jr. play as kind of that tight end and slot wide receiver hybrid. He's going to have Johnny Munt be a player who's going to be primarily a lead blocker for Dalvin Cook and protector for Kirk Cousins on either side of the offensive line. We'd likely see that. And he's going to actually put CJ Ham as more of a tight end type of role, meaning CJ Ham's not going to get a lot of his yards from the backfield. He's going to be primarily a receiver for our Vikings offense, a receiver and blocker for our Vikings offense. As we've seen in the past, CJ Ham has been a secret ingredient to the Vikings' success. And while when KOC came into this team, I believe the Vikings weren't actually going to continue with the fullback. They did just bring Jake Vargas back to our roster to be on the, assuming he's going to make our roster, or make the practice squad is what I mean to say. Meaning the Vikings are still looking to stick with the fullback, which is not very familiar to KOC from how he ran an offense with the Rams. Still, with that being said, I think we're actually only going to have 2 tight ends on a roster. Not only does KOC not typically use tight ends very often, or use multiple tight ends in the field very often, but we're very thin at the position. So we don't need to see a player like Zach Davidson be on a roster. We don't need to see a player like Nick Muse or Ben Ellison. All respect to these players, we don't need them on our roster when we have fullbacks who can play the position like CJ Ham can. So for that reason, I just believe the Vikings will only have 2 tight ends on the roster. When it comes to the other positions, if I'm making my predictions, defensive lineman is so questionable right now. And that's why I want to ask all of you guys, who do you think is going to be the 3rd defensive lineman starting on our Vikings defense? We obviously know it's going to be Harrison Phillips, Dalvin Tomlinson, but who else? If I'm guessing, I honestly believe it's going to be Kenny Willekes. Now, this prediction might age like milk, or this prediction might age like wine and Kenny Willekes turns into a star. At the end of the day, we have no clue what to expect, which is why defensive line and offensive line is so interesting to watch in this preseason and during training camp, because we're really going to kind of see these young players, what they're able to do, because like we've seen in the past, we don't know what a lot of these players are going to do because we didn't have team OTAs. We didn't have training camp a couple years back because of COVID. And now going into 2022, we don't know what a lot of these young players are able to do. So I'm really interested to see what a lot of these players can do. With that being said, thank you all for tuning into this show. These are the 5 positional battles on the Vikings roster as of right now to watch for in training camp and the preseason. Have yourself a great day.